What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Honor the Land. We are a day away from game day, and we have a very special solo episode today with just me, Max Lobes Leads, talking about the Browns and Jaguars coverage breakdown as well as run scheme data. A lot of you guys requested that I go into depth about what you can expect to see from opponents in the front, in the secondary, and everything in between. I'm going to do it. It's going to be a quicker episode, but if you guys are new watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe below. If you're listening on Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, make sure you are following so the next episode pops up in your feed. Without further ado, though, we're going to talk about this, and we're going to start with the Jaguars secondary. The Jacksonville Jaguars secondary. As you guys can see on my screen, it's some coverage data from the last game when they played against the Miami Dolphins. Now, what's really interesting about this is that it was super heavy man coverage. It was 73.2% man coverage and only 26.8% zone coverage. When you look at the coverage splits, though, there's a lot of cover one. So one high safety, probably a rat in the middle of the field or a robber, another safety coming down, and man coverage across the board. There was some cover two man. I think that's more reserved for third and long, down and long situations. About 19.5% was cover two man, and then 19.5% was cover two zone. And that was almost exclusively what they ran. Now, the numbers are a little inflated because it's only week one. However, I do think there is some substance to this because you were the Jacksonville Jaguars looking at your corners last week against the Miami Dolphins receivers, and you felt that comfortable playing that much man coverage against them. That kind of blows my mind. And I look at the Jaguars injury report this week, no Tyson Campbell, and it looks like no Darnell Savage right now either. So they could be without a starting corner and a starting safety. Now, we'd be fooling ourselves if we said the Browns wide receivers were the Dolphins wide receivers. They're obviously not. But if you're the Jacksonville Jaguars and you felt that confident in man coverage 73% of time against best receiver in the NFL and then another top 15, 20 guy, however you want to rank it, I still think they're going to feel comfortable with their man matchups. Now, the only thing is when you look at what Dallas did to the Cleveland Browns last week, it was very interesting. And I'll pull that up here too, because it was not as much man as we expected to see. Now, it was about half and half man, half and half, middle field closed, middle field open, but only 16.4% man. They played so much cover three, cover six, cover four. So 6 and 4 quarters variations, but cover three against this Browns team. And cover one, only 16% of the time. They didn't run any cover two man snaps. Lots of zone against Deshaun Watson and forcing him to make tight window throws. And like that makes sense, right? If you're Deshaun Watson or if you're game planning for Deshaun Watson, you want to try to make this guy make throws. And we saw it last week. Like he couldn't make a lot of them. So it's a very interesting crossroads here because the Jacksonville Jaguars, at least last week, demonstrated a different defensive identity. But this week, you look at what worked for the Cowboys against Deshaun Watson, very similar front. We talked about that, a little more banged up in the secondary. I think Deshaun Watson is going to see a lot of different things. But on those third downs, I'm not going to guarantee anything. I think the Browns are going to see a ton of man coverage. And what's really interesting here is when you look at the routes run, I'll pull up the routes run for the Cleveland Browns against man coverage. The routes run and the distribution with that stuff is really interesting, especially because the Cleveland Browns, whether you're in the slot, whether you're out wide, do things very differently. So let me pull this screen up for you guys right now. Okay. So last week, the Cleveland Browns, 51 routes for Amari Cooper, 51 routes for Elijah Moore, 43 routes for Jerry Jeudy. Obviously, David Njoku got hurt, but Jordan Akins had 7 more routes than he did. So if you are the Cleveland Browns and you're looking at the Jacksonville Jaguars running man coverage without their starting outside corner, one of the corners they have is Tyson Campbell, outside guy. You're probably going to look outside before you look inside. Who ran the most routes from the outside? Amari Cooper, 76.5% of the time from the outside. Jerry Jeudy, 65.1% of the time from the outside. Now, what's really interesting when you look at percentages, Cedric Tillman is third, Elijah Moore is fourth. But Elijah Moore had almost double the amount of routes run from out wide as Cedric Tillman did. What's really interesting, though, you look at the slot routes. Elijah Moore, 34. We saw Jerry Jeudy lined up in the slot a bunch. He had the second most slot routes at 14. But Elijah Moore, 34 slot routes. So when I look at the matchup for the Cleveland Browns, it's Amari Cooper out wide, It's Jerry Jeudy out wide. And can you take advantage of the matchups there? I think they can, and I think they will. This is a banged up secondary, guys. A really banged up secondary for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And to be honest with you, if they can't do that, if they can't, I'm going to calm down for a second here. If they can't get through that Jacksonville secondary, as banged up as they are, I know they don't have David Njoku, but as banged up as they are, I don't know if they can do it against a lot of other teams. Most other teams, to be honest with you. Now let's look at the Cleveland Browns defense. Probably more of what you'd expect, but a little bit different from Jim Schwartz. And I wonder why. Maybe they like the matchups. Maybe it was run fit stuff, but a good amount of man, 31.4% cover one man, but 51.4% cover three. 51.4% cover three. When you look at what the Miami Dolphins did last week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, we'll put that up real quick. When you look at what the Miami Dolphins did last week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, 24% man, 16% cover one, and again, 40% cover three. Both these teams, Browns last week, Miami Dolphins last week against Jacksonville, showed so much cover three. So much cover three. And to be honest with you guys, the Jacksonville Jaguars moved the ball down the field fine. I didn't think they had any issues moving the ball down the field. And the reality is, the Jaguars don't fumble at the goal line. They probably beat the Dolphins last week. The Dolphins are now 0-2. The Jaguars are 1-0 going into this game against Cleveland. I personally think the Jaguars will have some success on the air. We'll get into the run scheme data in a little bit here, but I can't see a lot of success really for either team on the ground, but definitely not the Jacksonville Jaguars. I am really, really fascinated to see how they attack the man coverage they're going to face, because I think a lot of teams do this. It's go into the slot against the Cleveland Browns because you want to attack Greg Newsome. Now, I thought Greg Newsome played great last week. I thought Greg Newsome had a very, very good game last week. I thought when he was asked to cover CeeDee Lamb, he did a fine job. And then when he was in the slot, Cooks, whoever it may be, he did a good job. I thought Greg Newsome was fine. But when you look at the wide receivers on the Jacksonville Jaguars, who ran the most routes from the slot, it's exactly who you think. And I think this is where the matchup is going to be, even though the targets were really evenly distributed. Christian Kirk, 14 routes from the slot, 4 targets from the slot. And what's most important here is 56% of his routes when there was a drop back were from the slot. So he was in the slot the most. He had 2 yards per route run in the slot. The only guy who had higher yards per route run in the slot was Brian Thomas, but he only ran 5. And I believe, if I'm correct here, on the second most routes out wide. Just double check here. Second most routes out wide. Now, Gabe Davis led the team in routes, which is really interesting. I don't think they really try to attack Gabe Davis against these Browns corners, especially on the outside. But if you're Brian Thomas, that's where I'm really fascinated, because I think the Browns will trust their guys in the secondary. I think they'll trust Martin Emerson. I think they'll trust Denzel Ward, trust Greg Newsome. That's what they do. But if you're Brian Thomas, you look that good last week against Jalen Ramsey, who I think has still looked pretty good so far this year. Do you trust yourself one-on-one? Does Trevor Lawrence trust you one-on-one? I think he might. I think he's going to see how deep the rabbit hole goes, and he's going to try these DBs. I would if I had a guy like Brian Thomas on my team. He's very, very talented. Where the Jaguars go against man, we wait to see. I honestly think now the Browns don't have Juan Thornhill. Ronnie Hickman's going to have to come in and play safety with Grant Delpit. I think Evan Engram is going to be more of a focal point in the offense this week. We wait to see what that looks like. But I think for the Jaguars offense, Browns defense, it'll be between the numbers. I think it'll be inside. We wait to see what that looks like come game day. But I do think that comes inside. I think that is the focal point for the Jacksonville Jaguars, whereas the Cleveland Browns focal point is more out wide. Let's talk some run scheme data, though, because I know you guys, if you're Browns fans, which I'm sure most of you are, really, really didn't like what you saw from the Browns run game last year. And I wouldn't like it either. Like, it was really bad. You look at yards per carry. I'll pull this data up real quick. You look at yards per carry for the Cleveland Browns, and they were, where they at? 4.89. Again, now a lot of that was in garbage time, but minimal explosive runs. Minimal explosive runs. Only 5% of their runs were explosive. And when you look at the overall, the overall success rate in their schematic runs, it was it was solid when it needed to be, right? They were better in the man gap scheme runs. They were better against the Cowboys in the fourth quarter. That's exactly what you expected from these Cleveland Browns, right? You may not like what you saw on the TV, but when you look at the numbers, it wasn't as bad as it seemed. 10th in zone concept success rate. They were, 15th in zone concept yards per carry. Success rate in man gap, second, but way down in yards per carry. So 3.6 yards per carry, 20th in the NFL last week. When you look at the Jacksonville Jaguars defense, that is where it gets really, really, really interesting because, look, you look at the Jaguars front, especially matched up against this Browns offensive line, which should be healthier this week. It should be healthier this week. We wait to see. But Jacksonville Jaguars last week against that very, very dynamic run game, third fewest yards per carry in the NFL. 3.24 yards per carry allowed, which is crazy to me. Like, that's a very dynamic run game from Miami. They shut Jeff Wilson down. They shut Raheem Mostert down. They did a really, really good job. When you look at how they did in the man gap compared to the zone, they were a little bit better against what the Browns are better at. So I go back and forth here. I'm not huge on the Cleveland Browns run game to begin with. I don't think the matchups are there. And I think the fact that the Browns have better matchups outside pushes them towards the pass game a little bit more. I think we're going to see more passes from the Cleveland Browns. Let's look at the other side, though. The Browns run defense, we all know, is really good. We all know it's really good, especially when it comes to efficiency. 4 yards per carry last week. 4 yards per carry allowed last week, which, again, is fine. Dallas Cowboys did gash them on a couple of draws, which is really, really fascinating to me because if you're the Jacksonville Jaguars, you probably also feel you don't have an advantage up front. Where's the efficiency going to come in your run game? Probably where you can catch people off guard. So I remember the Cowboys were to draw on, it's like 3rd and 5 or 3rd and 4, like 3rd and medium. Maybe they thought it was 4-down territory so they could get away with a run, but you had pass sets out of the offensive line. They ran a draw. They got like 10 yards. Now, the Browns were better against the zone run than they were against the man gap run. Not crazy noticeable, but they did a really good job of bottling up the man gap run, so that 3 yards and a cloud of dust type football when it comes to man gap scheme runs was better for the Cleveland Browns defense, even though they gave up more yards per carry. So efficiency, technically, it was worse, but overall success rate was better. When you look at the Jacksonville Jaguars, though, guys, this is a tough test. This is a tougher test than the Dallas Cowboys. I think that's the biggest thing here. 8th in the NFL last week in yards per carry, almost 5 yards per carry on the ground. And when you look at the success rate in the different types of runs, they were worse against what the Browns are better at, and they were better against what the Browns are worse at. Guys, 5.72 yards per carry in these man gap scheme runs. Now, whether it's Travis Etienne or Tank Bigsby, we wait to see. I think it's going to be a pretty steady dose of both. But this team can run the ball. They're not going to stop running the ball, and they're going to get to it in different ways. When you look at the game last year, I thought the Browns did a good job of keeping Trevor Lawrence contained and eliminating that aspect of the run game. But you also got to remember he was nursing a knee injury, and it was pretty clear to see. So it's tough to compare this game to the Browns-Jaguars game from last year. But I do think there are some similarities. I think the Jaguars are going to have to pass. I think the Browns are going to have to pass to succeed as well. I know the Jaguars' run defense kind of tapered off towards the end of the year last year, especially when they were playing the Browns. But I think the Browns are going to have to throw the ball to win this game. So player to look at on both sides of the ball for the Cleveland Browns, offense and defense, and then score prediction. Offense, I hate to use the same player 2 weeks in a row, but it's still Jerry Jeudy. I think that is the matchup Deshaun Watson needs to exploit. Amari Cooper is clearly their one, but seemed like Watson was favoring Jeudy in the matchups a little bit more last week. Jaguars probably won't have their 2 and 3 corners travel with Amari or anybody, but travel with Amari Cooper. So I think it's just going to be, where do you like the man matchups? Jerry Jeudy's the route runner. Jerry Jeudy's the deep threat. Amari Cooper can do it too, but I think Jerry Jeudy offers a little bit more. I think they lean Jeudy in that aspect. Guys, as for defense, I'm going to give 2 players because I don't know how it's going to work, but the safeties, whether it's Ronnie Hickman or Grant Delpit, who has more of a responsibility on Evan Engram. I think that's the biggest mismatch for the Jaguars in the pass game. When it gets to third down, where is Trevor Lawrence looking against man? Because the Browns are going to play man. It's probably Evan Engram. What matchup does he like? It's probably Evan Engram. Maybe it's Christian Kirk in the slot on Greg Newsome, but I think he's leaning Evan Engram. As for score prediction, game prediction, I go back and forth on this. I am trusting the Cleveland Browns to come and fight back after week one. I originally, earlier on in the week, I was a little more pessimistic about it. I do think the Jaguars secondary news really, really helps the Browns and what they're going to have to do this week, because I don't know how much success they're going to have on the ground. But Jack Conklin is probably back, whether he slides over to left, DeJuan Jones plays right, or DeJuan Jones just doesn't play and they keep James Hudson at left tackle is a huge thing. It's another huge, huge aspect to look at. But I'm going Browns. I think it's going to be a moderately low-scoring game. The weather is also, at least from what I looked at this morning, supposed to be a little rainy, supposed to be a little dirty. I'm going to go Cleveland Browns 19-17. I know that's an ugly score, but Cleveland Browns 19-17 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Again, I appreciate you guys hopping onto the solo episode today. If you're new, make sure you subscribe, make sure you like the video, and follow if you're listening on an audio platform. But go Browns. I appreciate you guys. We will see you next time around on Monday talking about this Browns, hopefully, win against the Jacksonville Jaguars.